This is Bee with Crafting Daily Dose, and this is the card that I'm sharing today. I saw a card by Joan Morris that used the donkey image to kick out 2020, and I wanted to make an interactive version of that card. So this is a modified flip-flap fold. I added a hidden magnet to create the movement, and there's a brad here that serves as a pivot point, and I'll show you how I make this card. The products that I'll be using today will be available starting January 5th through the end of February as part of Stampin' Up's Sale-a-bration promotion. So this is a gift with purchase event, and the Darling Donkeys stamp set and the Oh So Ombre Designer Series paper are both available at $50 levels. Darling Donkeys is a rubber stamp set with 3 donkey images and several sentiments. The Oh So Ombre paper is 48 sheets of 6x6, and they're double-sided. Comes in these 4 colors: Rococo Rose, Blackberry Bliss, Granny Apple Green, and Bermuda Bay, and that's the one that we'll be using today. I stamped and fussy cut the donkey image. I'm coloring it with Stampin' Wet markers in Basic Gray, Smoky Slate, and Petal Pink, and I'm also using a paintbrush with some water. I'm not an expert colorist by any means, but I generally start with the darker shade, and I'm just going to trace around the curvature of the body, and then also darken some areas that I think there'd be more shadows, like on the back legs. The base of the ears. I'm going to switch over to the lighter gray, and I generally start in with those areas that are already colored and just kind of pull that color in towards the middle to help it blend a little bit better. And then finally, I come in with a paintbrush with just barely any water. If you see water pooling up like that, that's too much. Just spreading that pigment around. While I still have some color left over, I'm going to fill in the snout, the mane, and the part of the tail. Now I'm using a thick white cardstock. This is not watercolor paper, so you don't want to get it too wet. Finally, I'm going to put in a little bit of this petal pink on the ear, tiny bit on the bottoms of the hooves. Clean up my brush with just clean water. Oops, I have too much again. You can see it kind of pooling there. Spread that pigment up a little bit. I realized I missed a couple areas right here. And that's it. I'm going to turn my donkey over, and I'm going to attach one of these strong neodymium magnets to his snout. You want to be very careful with these magnets because they can cause problems if they're ingested. So if you've got young children or pets, just be cautious. I'm going to take a glue dot. I have some of these leftover glue dots from paper pumpkin kits. And I'm going to put it right on his snout. And then I'll put one of the magnets on. Now, the glue dots are very strong, but I'm just going to add a little extra insurance by reinforcing the hold with the fine tip glue pen. I'm going to be very, very generous with putting glue all around this, creating kind of a border. It's a little bit tricky because the tip is attracted to the magnet, so you might end up with glue in some places that you didn't intend. Just scrape that off. We're going to set the donkey aside because it's going to take some time for that to dry completely and to set up. I'm going to use the coordinating Bermuda Bay cardstock. This is cut for a standard A2 size, so 8.5 by 5.5, scored down the middle at 4 1/4, and I'll also need some white cardstock. Now I'm going to be cutting out panels for the front of the card using the stitched rectangle dies. I'm using the second largest rectangle for the white, and then the third largest rectangle for the pattern paper. These are the pieces after they have been die cut. Now this together forms the front panel, and this is going to be what supports our mechanism. The pattern paper is not sturdy enough to do that by itself, and so I figured as long as we were going to be layering it on top of the white, we might as well add a little interest by making them different sizes. And I chose to cut out a piece from pretty much the center of the pattern paper so that I could get the most variation in tone, but if you needed to conserve paper, you could certainly cut it from the edge instead. We're going to use our Stampin' seal to put these together, and I'm going to pay particular attention to this area right here. I want to make sure that I put some extra on the back, so when I flip it over, it's going to be this area here, where I want to make sure that I put enough adhesive. Let's mark our front panel. I'm going to make a dot that is 3 inches in from the left and 1 inch from the bottom. And then I'm going to make a line that starts out at 5/8 of an inch from the left edge and is 1 1/4 inch from the top edge. And actually, I'm going to continue that line for just a little bit. Now that our card is marked up, I'm going to bring in the classic label punch, and I'm going to line up the left edge of this guideline with the left edge of the punch. And then the rest of the line is just helping me make sure that I keep things fairly straight and punch. Now, if you don't have this punch, you can also create a slot here by using your trimmer or maybe a craft knife. The important thing is you want it to be 2 inches wide and at least 1/8 of an inch high. Now for the hole, if you have a paper piercer, that would be great to use. I'm just going to use a thumbtack, and then I have a little wedge of styrofoam just to support the paper underneath. You can use a paper piercing mat or even an old mouse pad. I'm just going to punch a hole, and once the hole has been started, I'm just going to work it around, trying to make that hole a little bit bigger. I found a brad from my stash, and I'm just going to put it inside that hole that we just made, kind of work its way through. And once it's in, I'm going to twist it around, again trying to make that hole a little bit bigger. We want this mechanism to be able to move very smoothly and freely. When that's done, I'm going to use just a scrap piece of cardstock and lay it right next to the brad before I pull down the prongs. And the reason for this is just to make sure that I'm not pulling the prongs down too close to the paper. This helps me leave a little gap. If you're familiar with sewing, it's just like putting a shank on a button. And twist it around. Okay, now we're going to make the mechanism that goes inside this. I'm bringing in my trimmer for the next step. We want to cut a piece of cardstock. If you have the thicker white cardstock, that's even better. I'm going to cut it 3.5 inches wide by 5.25 inch high. So 3.5. Five and 1/4. Now, take the short edge and put it up against the guide of the trimmer at 2 inches. 2 inches. I'm going to cut down from the top edge down to 2 3/4 inches. So notice that there are measurements on the right side of the guide. We want to go down to 2 3/4 inches. There is a notch, I don't know if you can see that, in the middle of the trimmer blade, right on the handle there. And we're going to keep going until that notch matches the 2 3/4 inch. And stop. Here's my cut edge. I'm going to turn it counterclockwise. And now I'm going to put the long edge in at 2 3/4 inches. And we're going to cut from the top edge down to 1.5. So basically we're going to make those two cuts join up with one another. Once I have my piece, I'm going to make some score lines. So I'm going to turn it around just so that I can have the straight edge up against the guide. And I'm going to score at 1 1/8 and 1 5/8. For the 1 1/8, you can choose to use the guidelines that are on this side, but it doesn't go to 5/8, so I'm just going to go ahead and use this side. So I want to move my cutting blade out of the way. I don't want to accidentally cut that. Use the scoring blade. So 1 1/8. 1 5/8. And then I have this sort of L-shaped piece. I'm going to take these and fold them towards me. Now that the trimmer is out of the way, I'm just going to take my bone folder, really reinforce those folds. And I'm also going to work them in the opposite direction just to make sure that the mechanism is going to work more smoothly. Now we're ready to install the mechanism. I'm going to use tear-on tape. Now this tape is strong and it is good at tearing, but for mechanical cards, I like to be a little bit more precise with the adhesive. So I'm just going to use a spare pair of scissors to trim that off, putting it against the lower edge of our notch. And notice I'm not using my good snips for that because I don't want to risk getting them gummed up with adhesive. Take the pull tab mechanism and feed it through the slot. You're going to fold it at that second fold for now. You're going to line the bottom edge of the flap with the bottom edge of the adhesive once we remove the backing. And at the same time, that should line up the crease here with the white border. Now you can see that when you pull this tab, that top panel gives way. We're bringing the donkey back in. It's got the magnet on the back. But for right now, we're going to focus on putting him on top of this brad. And for that, I'm going to use another glue dot. This is going to go underneath his sort of chest area here. I want to make sure that the ears don't get in the way of this panel over here. And I also want to make sure that his snout is going to go over the part of the pull tab that is underneath the front panel. Once you have him positioned the way that you want, grab another one of those magnets. And what we're going to do is flip the front panel over and let the two magnets sort of find each other. So you kind of hover it over where the donkey is approximately, let go, and it will find where it's supposed to go. Get another glue dot and put it on this magnet. Remove the backing and then press down this pull tab onto the magnet. Go ahead and test your mechanism. I'm going to hold it this way to support it since it's not mounted on a card yet. When you pull on the tab, the donkey should also move. You want to make sure that as it moves up, that its tail doesn't hit up into that panel right here. So if that is happening, you might want to readjust it a little bit. If your donkey is not moving well, the most likely culprit would be that the hole for the brad is not large enough, so you might want to go back and enlarge that. Once you know that everything is working properly and that you're happy with the placement, I would go ahead and carefully disassemble it so that you can reinforce the holds with more of the liquid glue like we did before. So I'm going to carefully remove this brad, trying to make sure that that donkey stays in place relative to it. And then I'll come back in with my liquid adhesive and go all the way around. I'm going to come back in with this tab. And reinforce around here too. Wipe away the excess. Now you're going to want to put something on top of that that's going to not stick, because as this dries and sets up, you don't want it to be stuck to the front panel of your card. So if you've got some sticker release paper, that works, or I'm just going to use the silicone mat here and leave that aside to dry. Now that the glue around my magnets has dried, I reassembled the front card panel and I'm ready to mount it onto my card base. So this has been folded. I'll go ahead and crease it. In order to mount this and make sure everything moves smoothly, I'm using these foam adhesive sheets. They're very easy to cut, so I've gone ahead and trimmed off some sections that are a 1/2 inch wide. I used a craft knife, but you can also use scissors. So on the back, I'm going to put adhesive only in the areas that are not going to interfere with this mechanism. So I'm going to put them along the left side, the right side, and some along the top. I don't have any Bermuda Bay ribbon, but I found something in my stash that kind of matches, and I cut off an 8-inch length. I'm going to thread it through this hole and tie it off. I'm going to test my mechanism one more time to make sure that it smooths. Before I mount this onto the front of my card, I'm going to take my snips and just round out the corners here of this pull tab. Then I'm going to take a hole punch and put a hole right here because I'm going to thread a ribbon through it later. I don't have any Bermuda Bay ribbon, but I found something in my stash that kind of matches, and I cut off an 8-inch length. I'm going to thread it through this hole and tie it off. I'm going to test my mechanism. Since everything works, I'm going to take off the backing. I'll slide this back on up. And I'm ready to center it onto my card. One last check. For this last step, I'm going to need 2 little pieces of cardstock that are going to cover this area. They're both 2 1/8 inch wide. The shorter one is 1 1/8 inch, and the taller one is 1 5/8 inch in height. They're going to go like this. Before we glue these in place, I'm going to take this one and I'm going to stamp on the upper portion of this flap. I'm going to take some anti-static powder and then stamp my hee-haw sentiment using Versamark. And remember, I'm just staying on the top portion. Put some embossing powder on that. This is the white embossing powder. And heat it up. I'm going to use tear and tape to put this panel onto just the space in between these 2 folds here. And the reason I'm using tear and tape is just because as that moves around, I don't want that to accidentally go flying off. I want to put a second strip here. It's a little bit too wide. So I'm going to put it onto some release paper. Whenever I use up a pack of stamps, or if I get an invoice that is on this sort of sticker release paper, I save it because it's very helpful for situations like this. going to put it on there, and then that just makes it easier for me to cut and get this a little bit less wide. Okay, peel off the release. Now when I go to put this on, remember it needs to be flipped down, so it's actually going to go this way. And I want to make sure that I'm not putting it over this fold, because then it's going to interfere with the flipping mechanism. I'm ready to put on this last panel. This adhesive doesn't have to be quite as strong, so I'm just going to use the Stampin' Seal. My panel is a little bit wider than this white panel on the pull tab because I want to cover up the sides of the hole that was made by our punch, so I'm not going to get adhesive to the very edge. I'm going to glue on these little numbers that I have. I cut these out with an electronic cutting machine. I don't have the pattern play dies. If you do, you might try it, though it may be a little bit too wide for these measurements, so you would want to adjust these panels. If you don't have either of those, you could print them out onto cardstock. Just run the cardstock through your printer and put 2020 and 2021 on it, or you can hand draw it in. And of course, you can put really any images that you want on these panels once the new year's passed. I hope you enjoyed a little dose of creativity with this project and that you'll join me the next time. Remember, these products will be available as free gifts with purchase beginning January 5th. Hope you have a great day.